Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to make a little video bringing together Tom Holland's presentation to Unheard and that excellent Universal History episode with Jonathan Peugeot and Richard Rowland about nationalism. Now, I sort of bump into this in my sermon this week. My sermon this week is on Acts 19, where Paul is in Ephesus. It's a fairly famous passage where Paul is doing ministry in Ephesus, and things really heat up in Ephesus. And Paul's time in Ephesus, he spends at least 2 years there, and it's very effective ministry. There's a lot of miracles. There's a whoosh. There's a whoosh, and there's so much of a whoosh that the silversmiths get upset because they begin to realize that Christianity is sort of unseating the local patron deity. And that local patron deity is really critical to the polis and the sense of the city. And in the book of Acts, there are many riots that break out with respect to what happens when Paul comes to town. He seems to be sort of a riot generator. But it's interesting when first you have this little speech by Demetrius that, hey, if we lose this temple thing, now there's lots of layers to that, because obviously 410 AD and the sack of Rome and the charge against Christians for Rome was sacked because Christians no longer participated in the cults and the temple worship of the patron gods of the city. There's so much that is tied into this transition through antiquity into Christianity. But what's interesting is that there's this, it's not a nationalism because it's a nation. It's basically the city. It's their identity. That's sort of the smaller nationalism of the identity. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. The cities are often named like Athens after the gods of the city. And so you have this connection between heaven and earth. Again, we had a great estuary meeting last night, and one woman who in the little estuary groups very often recommends the topic that the whole group pick up. She's had quite a run. Didn't quite work in our group last night, but she mentioned many of the issues. She wasn't at the Chino conference. She mentioned many of the issues that were very much at the Chino conference. That life is fragmented. There's no longer a place, a sense of identity from a place. All of this is really important for human beings, and you can see how this is functioning in the Roman Empire. You can also see how there's this need for this. There's this connection between heaven and earth, and I talked about the fact that you drive through the Netherlands, this flat lowlands, and then you see these church spires. You also see these very ugly electricity generating windmills, which I wouldn't be surprised 20, 30 years from now they'll be all gone and taking up a huge amount of landfill space, and people will look at them as a giant mistake. People are already having second thoughts about these things. But the whole idea of a church sort of connecting heaven and earth. And so these, quite clearly in temples around Greece, these were connecting heaven and earth. And then Paul comes in and people start to become Christians, and miracles are done and exorcisms are done. And this whole thing is disrupted. Now, part of what happens then is this movement, and I thought Tom Holland, now in promoting his books Pax, which I'm really disappointed it's not coming sooner to America, but had a great little session on this in the question and answer period in what was really a terrific video on Unheard about the book. Oh, I gotta get my sound arranged. Here we go. This should be better.
Christianity represented, and the contrast between the extremely ruthless pre-Christian Roman world and what I was struck by your saying that Pax for them meant something much more active.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a case to be made, as I seem to recall Gibbon sort of did, that Christianity was the ultimate example of the Romans getting soft and was what broke the empire?
So that
This argument I hear all the time.
Someone's at the front door.
Oh, someone's at my front door. My lovely wife, who's on her summer break, brought it in for me.
I mean, that is what Gibbon says, and it's also what Nietzsche says.
And this weakness of Christianity is something that Gibbon asserted it. In terms of a lot of the thinking about the rise and fall of empires, this is sort of a perennial thing. You know, Christians in their ethic are too weak. Of course, you have the Anabaptists and the pacifists and all of these issues.
Nietzsche says it's
Case to be made, as I seem to recall Gibbon sort of did, that Christianity was the ultimate example of the Romans getting soft and was what broke the empire.
So that I mean, that is what Gibbon says, and it's also what Nietzsche says. Nietzsche says it's a slave morality. I think that I think actually the opposite. I think what's amazing about the Roman Empire is that it endures as long as it does. It's not that it falls, it's that it endures as long as it does. And the reason why it's surprising that the Roman Empire holds together, and the reason why Romania does not exist when China does, is that there are massive geographical fracture points across the Mediterranean world and beyond. So if you think about the war between Julius Caesar and Pompey, or between Octavian and Mark Antony, that kind of dividing line between the eastern half of the Roman Empire and the western half of the empire, going down the Adriatic, is one that in the long run will see the western half of the empire implode completely and the eastern half become what we now call Byzantium. I mean, it's kind of hardwired into the geography. There are other fracture points. So the Alps is an obvious one, the Pyrenees, the Mediterranean, most obviously, the Channel, the Rhine, the Danube. It's very, very difficult to make imperial structures cohere in antiquity, and so it's staggering that happens. I think that the thing that enables people in the long run to continue feeling Roman, even when the kind of the sinews of government have been cut and the imperial hold has gone, is that they retain a shared identity as Roman, which has come to be fused with Christianity. And the reason that Christianity is so successful, and I think the reason, if you're looking at it in Darwinian terms, why it's adopted, is that in this period that Pax covers, this is a world that is full of different cult centers. And the Romans, by and large, feel that they're all equally valid. You can go and pay sacrifice to someone in northern Britain.
Now again, this is the point here. The world is full of different cult centers. They're full of Ephesians with Artemis, and you have all of these sort of local deities and local gods. And now, of course, your relationship with Artemis isn't exclusive if you need some help from another god to get something else fixed. But sort of the patron god of the city will be your identity.
Or in Syria or whatever, and these are all gods. But in the long run, the heft of these cult centers depends on them being local. That's the whole point. I mean, as with the temple in Jerusalem, it's the fact that they are local that matters. Christianity changes that. The Christians.
Now, again, it's helpful to remember that the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and in that period, you begin to get, of course, the rise of the book and the rise of the synagogue. So with the Babylonian exile and the rise of the book and the rise of the synagogue, you get this sort of mediating practice among the scattered children of Israel all around the world where there isn't a temple, but then the temple comes back again. So then you have this period where it's sort of a both and.
The Christian people have no metropolis. This is what seems so odd to the Romans in the early years of Christianity. They are a kind of universal people they're rootless cosmopolitans, you might want to say. But it's precisely that ultimately makes Christianity so suited to an empire that is universal in scope, because you can have churches anywhere and they're all consecrated to the same God. So it doesn't matter if it's in Egypt or in East Anglia, they're all consecrated to the same God. And it's that enables a sense of being Roman to endure for as long as it does. So I think that actually Gibbon gets it the wrong way around.
So, of course, today we had the live stream with Nate and Richard Rowland, and we're talking about the Grail. And it's a completely strange thing for me to be talking about something like the Grail. And, what is this? How is this germane? It's this thing in the story. One of the things that occurred to me, really, when I was having a conversation yesterday with some people in the corner, and is that, again, the question, I talked about this on the video that I released this morning, the messy video, that people in the corner are like, well, we should do something. Okay, well, actually, there's a lot of things for us to do here. Talking is something that we do. Creating stories, making better stories. And I think, we talked a little bit about Mrs. Davis, and the more we see what that story is about, the worse and worse it is. And someone really needs to tap Bishop Barron on the shoulder and say, you need to make a third video about this story, correcting yourself, because these videos are driving a whole bunch of Christians to watch this story, and it's not going well. And so we do need better stories, and we do need more Tolkiens and Lewises to write Narnia and Middle Earth, and we do need, it's Richard says at some point we're going to get into Shakespeare, and that may well be. There are many around here who are into Harry Potter far more than I am, and maybe that's something I should pick up when I finish off the Cosmic Trilogy, as Richard calls it. But a big piece for this for me is this question of, okay, what's going on? And the meta-modern thing is definitely a part of it. And that's a word that's used out there in the broader culture to figure out what's going on, because all of this stuff should have been laid to rest. That was sort of what modernity was. But then, of course, post-modernity comes along and just takes a hammer to modernity without leaving anything functional in its wake. And so people are picking up the pieces and putting things together. And in the medieval period, people are picking up the pieces of the classical period and putting things together in a new Christian way. And I think one of my frustrations is that I'd really love for Jordan and Daily Wire to release the Exodus seminar out onto open YouTube. You say, well, that's rather hypocritical of you, Vanderclay, just when you start your membership section and some things are behind a paywall. Well, number one, there's not a lot behind the paywall. Number two, most of the things that are going behind the paywall are going to come out at some point. And number three, a lot of the things that are behind the $2.99 paywall that are going to stay there are because, number one, they're just sort of too messy for the open internet. And number two, there are conversations that none of you would see at all if I didn't have some kind of paywall up, because there are a lot of people who quite sensibly want to tell their stories and share their ideas, but don't want to be on the open internet. So that's a very wise and reasonable thing. But I'd love to see the Exodus seminar come out, because one of the things I really took away from the Exodus seminar was the connecting of heaven and earth. Phlebas asks in this video at some point, whether the Grail was physical, and we'd basically talked about that in terms of the fact that in some ways this story element, this narrative element that develops in history, called the Holy Grail, and that's exactly what it is. It's a narrative element that points to, It's a narrative element that points to the redemption of the physical world. That's what the Grail is. I should probably write that down. Maybe I'll tweet it. Tweeted a thing about Calvinism just to send Twitter into a tizzy. And so, again, and I didn't. So even Mrs. Davis served a redemptive purpose for me, because if they hadn't used the Grail, it just would have been. But the Grail, as this narrative element, flows through all of these different stories, and because it has reality in this narrative world, and as tradition in this narrative world, it's going to pull and resist. It's going to resist corruption, and when it's corrupted, it will be known. There's this whole conversation too about canonicity and text. When you talk about the canonicity of Star Trek or Star Wars or Harry Potter or other fan fiction, I mean, that's sort of how these things work in the narrative world. And in the Exodus seminar, Jonathan Peugeot does a nice job of noting how the connection between heaven and earth, and I think does a nice job of sort of seeing how Israel and the law and all of the elements of the tabernacle and such, these are all connections between heaven and earth. And there's always this is in many ways some of the tension between God number one and God number two, the arena and the agent, the transcendent and the immanent, the universal and the local. And so what you have it with Artemis is that she's local. Now, again, she's over a whole bunch of things. You can, like all these Roman gods, they're gods of all these things. And one might say, I mean, I remain a Protestant, so patron saints, part of the universal history is they're helping me understand, well, what do these patron saints do? And one of the things that was very interesting in, all the way back to my days of prepping to go to the Dominican Republic and work with Haitians, how in many cases, like with Haiti and syncretism, you get gods being replaced by patron saints. And there's certainly a very valid critique that you can be made of this, which the Protestant reformers did. But it's also helpful to understand the psychological movements that made these things. And I thought this was what Jonathan and Richard articulated well, again, in the nationalism and the universal history thing.
But with increasing locality, that nest the local and the specific within the universalizing and the cosmic. So in a universe.
Okay, so right there he said it, but he said it in a very abstract way. He had this great meme about Megamind where you go all the ways through and then you get to the bottom, and that's basically what happens. I should probably find the meme.
I don't start out by trying to give them the nuanced version of stories. I just here's a saint story, here's a Bible story, whatever. Like when you're older, we can, but it's really important if you cannot appreciate the story on its sort of like on a naive level. One of my Joshua Gibbs, who's a classical educator and just a wonderful writer, he calls this high credulity. So you start out by reading the stuff from a place of high credulity. If I read in a legend that Saint Augustine of Canterbury was thinking about turning home, and then Saint Peter appeared to him in a dream and flogged him for his lack of zeal, then my first response should not be, now, what can this possibly mean? Right? We start out by just reading it as, well, St. Peter appeared to St. Augustine of Canterbury in a dream and flogged him for his lack of zeal. And then, just sort of like, you can go from there. But if you don't start there, this is one of the things that low-key, this is one of the main goals of the Universal History Project, but we have to do it backwards. Because we have to help people like kind of step back into this stuff, right? If I tell you St. George killed a dragon, then people go, well, okay, but what is it? But if I start out with, well, dragons mean this and symbolize this, and it's like the galaxy brain meme, right? Where you start out with St. George killed a dragon, and then St. George killed a demon in the form of a dragon, and then St. George killed like this is actually not a thing that happened historically. It's just symbolic of all these different things. And then its dragons symbolize this. And at the very end of the meme, it's St. George killed a dragon, right?
And that's pretty much what C.S. Lewis does in Miracles, is sort of walk through that with respect to a number of things. And as Richard said, in universal history, they sort of go in reverse here. And you see that right here because he sort of starts at the top and then he's going to work his way down.
Like we're talking about with increasing locality, that nest the local and the specific within the universalizing and the cosmic. So in our Universal History series, we've been mainly focused on these kinds of stories. This is what we've been mainly looking at, right? How did people groups, as they converted, nest their identity within the Christian and within the Roman story?
Now, of course, they needed this universal history to make the connections. Because what Tom Holland noted is that part of what happens with Christianity is because it is not like Artemis of the Ephesians, and it is not like all the local gods. Now, of course, in some groups will then have patron saints function in this way instead of the local gods. And then, of course, Protestant missionaries years later are going to come back and say, "Hey, wait a minute. You've just taken out your god and put a saint in, and they're functioning in all the same ways." And yeah, they have a point. But what's happening then in that conversation are the tensions between the universal and the local. And the truth is you need both. And you just sort of, you work them in different ways. Now, obviously, when you have a cathedral, when you have a building, that building then in the landscape of your flat Dutch plain is going to in some ways function like Artemis of the Ephesians and the cathedral. And of course, then you're going to have your relics and all of those things in there. And so what you can see psychologically in this is sort of how this universe works. Now, I'm not either lamenting or defending the Protestant Reformation in this, but just noting that these tensions and dynamics are there. And sort of if you start from the top, you're going to have to get down below. Now, I think Protestants do it by, and American evangelicals have done it in the 70s and 80s by saying you need a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Well, what does that mean? Well, Jesus, you're going to need to, maybe you're going to adopt sort of Brother Lawrence's prayer or something like that, but Jesus is going to have to come down right here. And this is where, as Richard Rowland notes, churches, even churches that are iconoclastic, well, they sort of have their holy places, and they sort of have their saints, and they sort of have their icons, and they sort of have their relics, but of course the theological environment around it is different, but there's a psychological functionality that continues to endure.
And when they themselves maybe fell outside of the empire. Just to emphasize again, before we get into the next section, is that these identities, they stack or they nest. And if you don't understand this, then you will make the mistake, which as I'm going to try to argue is basically the mistake of 19th and 20th century nationalism, which is to create something that's very top heavy, right? Where it's more about, here's the narrative.
Okay, now nationalism, obviously, for the people of Ephesus, Diana or Artemis is the connector between heaven and earth. And so with Paul's evangelism and with the Christianization of it, that gets threatened and they respond back. So here you have you very clearly have spiritual warfare, because it's the spirit of Diana versus the spirit of Christ, and Christ's going to win. Christ wins. The Temple of Diana, even if we wished it were still there, it probably would have been converted but at some point it gets burned down. Actually, it gets destroyed, if I recall correctly. It gets destroyed by the Goths, who come in and destroy it, and nobody bothers to rebuild it. And if you go back to The Rest is History and you look at their episode about the ancient Olympic Games, which was a fascinating episode, people want to say things like, "Oh, horrible Christianity destroyed the Olympics." No, the Olympics were abandoned It simply wasn't needed anymore because it was replaced by Christianity, and all those particularities of the Olympic Games weren't functioning. Now the modern Olympics rise up, and now there'll be continuity and discontinuity between the modern Olympics and the other, but psychologically you can see how these things are functioning. And so then nationalism comes, and it's a bigger container than just the city. And so now you have other nation states that in some ways are drawing the connection. Let's play a little bit more of this.
That actually has to control and oppress everything beneath it rather than serve as a container for it.
Yeah, that's really important. And that's when you can see, I mean, in general, that's when you can see how when any identity goes wrong is when it doesn't respect the normal nesting of identities that are below it, right? It's like, as let's say a family, a father, it's like, okay, the father is the head of the family, but the father is the head of the family in the way that is there to make his children and his wife be fruitful. And
so I've played this video before, this section of this video, where they're basically talking about tyranny and not respecting.
And succeed and be themselves, right? And have their own lives ultimately. And so that's the way that all identities should function. Now that's the way God functions, and that's the way that all identities should function. That's why people are, when we talk about nationalism, they become very tense because they always think that all that means is, like you said, the way that the Third Reich presented their nationalism as this completely identity that takes over. But it's not just the Third Reich, right? Napoleon and a lot of modern national identity had that feature, but it was not a feature of ancient thinking.
Yeah. I think a much overlooked vision in scripture is Nebuchadnezzar's first dream, right? The one, I think it's his first one, but the one of the tree, right? So he has everybody remembers the vision of the statue being destroyed by the stone cut out of the mountain, but in his vision of the tree, right, it's the idea of the tree, and of course the tree is the king, right? The tree is this beautiful tree. It gives shade to the plants beneath it, and also the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. The wild beasts kind of gather around it. But that's what the king is supposed to be, and you could say that that's whatever your story that gives identity, that's what it is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be this tree that, the birds of the air, these various principalities, and the beasts of the field, which are, the things that are lower down, right? They can come and they can find shelter and shade and protection. And of course, in his dream, ultimately, because of his pride, the tree gets cut down. But the point is that this is what the king, or
in other words, both levels are important, and for it to be functioning properly, the king, Jesus basically says it, the greatest among you must be the servant of all, and you tie the top and the bottom in your structure.
You could say the grand story, whatever it is, that's how it's supposed to function.
Yeah.
And obviously this didn't always function perfectly, but there is but it functions surprisingly well, let's just say, right? Even when you have somebody like the Pope saying, I think it's in maybe the 5th century, saying, okay, nobody in the West is allowed to read the Book of Enoch anymore, But then there were still places on the outer branches of the West, in Scotland and Ireland and the British Isles particularly, where people kept all of these things, right? And they sort of kept them, they still remembered them, and it was still part of, again, not just a book in a monastery, but teaching from Enoch, teaching from the apocryphal books was actually a major part of parish life in Anglo-Saxon England, right? And so there was space, even when you had somebody who tried to totalize things in some way, there was space for this stuff to kind of fit in.
Yeah, but one of the reasons that's why it's hard for us to think that way, is that because we live in a technocratic society, we confuse authority with power. Because we have the capacity now for authorities to have indefinite power, and so when the president or whatever, when the authorities say something, they can implement it completely into
all
the
way
world.
Down. Yeah.
Whereas in an ancient world, that wasn't the case. The Pope can be in Rome saying whatever he's saying, and it's going to have influence, but it's not. He doesn't have the means to enforce it all through Christendom, and so there's always this organic variability that.
And it's interesting in this current moment with the current Pope, and you you see the tensions in this, because on one hand, people are like, well, the Pope should rise up and squash that. Oh, okay, that's what the Pope should do. But oh no, the Pope shouldn't squash anything. But then the Pope makes a move against the other thing, and you can fill in that and the other thing to whichever degree you want. And so the Pope shouldn't be trying to, well, I'll fill in one. The Pope shouldn't be trying to get rid of the Latin Mass. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. And, and so there's always tensions. And those same tensions were running through the Christian Reformed Church Synod.
That installs itself just naturally by just normal human mechanisms.
So,
yeah.
Along comes the Protestant Reformation, right? And the result of the Reformation, and it has to be remembered that the Reformation took place in Germany, right? It was primarily, in its beginning, it was primarily...
Okay, now, again, I know some Protestants get frustrated with me. You should be defending our team. Well, I think I am defending our team by not leaving our team, because there are reasons for our team, and the biggest defense of it is that I remain Protestant and have no inclinations or temptations to go to Rome or to the Orthodox. I continue to be Team Protestant, and part of that is, I think there's always this tension between this universal that Tom Holland was noting, and then the particular. And obviously a big part of the Protestant Reformation was, trying to, well, I mean, the saints and the relics and all this in some areas, and I'm sure it was very different throughout Europe. The Protestant Reformation was very different throughout Europe. Europe was very segmented, and it's very interesting how, as he's about to say, the Protestant Reformation takes off in Germany. It doesn't take off in Spain. Has a little bit more grip in France, but if you read, for example, that book that I've read on Vatican I, Ultramontanism versus Gallicanism. Gallicanism is basically France, and then that will manifest itself in the French Revolution. So you have very different. Obviously, you have the question about the king, the relationship between the king and the Pope. I mean, this is enormously complex. The Protestant Reformation takes off in Germany, takes off in the Netherlands, in Hungary, in Switzerland, and then eventually in England, and then via England it will come to America. And from America it will go out to the rest of the world. But you've always got this balancing between these two things, between this universal and then the particular. And it's not like the balance is just sort of a binary thing. It gets played out in innumerable things. So, for example, with John Calvin in Geneva to create this holy city to go from a 2-speed to a 1-speed religion, we're going to embody it now in some ways here in the city again. But it's not going to be Artemis, as in Ephesus. It's going to be Christianity with this Calvinist persuasion, and you're going to have that in these little places of French refugees, because of course John Calvin was French. He left France, and he writes his Institutes, his most famous and successful book, to Francis I, King of France, as an apology, and he says all sorts of deferential things to the king. Listen to the rest of his history on the American Revolution, and just notice how for a long time, it's not till the very end that the colonists finally sort of throw the king under the bus and say no more king, as in Schoolhouse Rock. So all of these tensions between these things are going to be enormously subtle, and they're going to come out in lots of different ways in lots of different places.
Really a German religious movement, right? Obviously it gives France and Switzerland and England, other places, but originally it's primarily a German religious movement, except that the Reformation didn't take place in Germany, because Germany did not exist. Germany is a made-up country. Fake news, everybody. No, Germany's a made-up country, right? There, if you look at a medieval map, there's no...
And if you listen to the rest of his history, they have a great episode on the establishment of Germany and everything that went into it.
Germany, yeah, on that map. Nobody who lived in the place that we call Germany now would have called themselves Germans. Actually, they still don't call themselves Germans. a really fun game is actually what's the name of German in other languages, and like I don't
Yeah.
know what do you guys call it in French?
Allemand.
Yeah, right. Because like the Allemande.
and in Spanish, Alemania. But now, be careful, because Italy. And when you get into Napoleon, Vatican I, you're dealing with similar things, and so it's nice to sort of show the complicity of this. But part of what's happening in Europe is that many of these forces are expressing themselves in the Protestant Reformation in one way, but as again Carlos Erie, his book on reformations, well, they're getting expressed in different ways, and in questions about how the formation of Rome is and papal authority with Vatican I, and then of course you're going to have Vatican II. I mean, these are enormously complex movements that are going through, and they're wrestling with some of these perennial tensions that are structural. They're structural in ways that we struggle to find language to articulate.
Main region, right?
Right.
Right. So it's yeah. Nobody who lived there called themselves Germans, right? This German, but Germany is a modern construct.
Yeah.
But the way that it was built, the story sort of begins in the Protestant Reformation. I don't have like a ton of time to go into this, but let's say that as a result of the Protestant Reformation, we got something called the 30 Years' War in Western Europe, which is one of the bloodiest periods in Western Europe. Actually, not the Middle Ages, right? But this is now in the modern period. 30 Years' War, incredibly bloody struggle between Roman Catholics and Protestants over basically a very small slice of Western Europe.
Yeah.
And the end result of the 30 Years' War is something called the Treaty of Westphalia. And one of the things that comes about as a result of that treaty is that they decide, okay, your religion will be determined simply by whatever principality you live in. So like if you live in this little province,
Recognize this from Ephesus. Now, the transformation is complete. It's been Christianized, but it's once again a localization.
and some of these are quite small, basically the size of what in Texas would be a county. I don't know. Do you guys call them parishes or counties, or like what's the unit in Canada beyond the city?
Yeah, we do have
In Canada or Quebec?
something like that. I forget what they're called. Yeah,
Okay.
we have Conti. Yeah.
Yeah, county. Yeah. So, but basically these very small principalities, and your religion, if you lived there, would just be whatever the religion of. And so what happened was that instead of the identity conferred by the Christian story being kind of at the very outside level, is that it collapsed down actually several levels into the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it goes from being, here's a universalizing story of Passion Week and Pascha, right? Of Rome and Greece, of the Trojan War and, St. John the Baptist, right? All these things, like, this is our universalizing story that kind of is the container that holds everything together. And now that collapses, actually several rungs down the ladder, right? To now, it's actually secondary to your political identity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once you kind of understand when that happened and how that happened, you can then understand how it's actually a pretty short trip to go from there to now my religious identity or my spiritual identity or whatever is something that I confer upon myself
Yeah, it's
now.
a personal thing.
Right? Yeah, but also isn't that also like political identity also has collapsed down to that level now?
Yeah.
So you can freely associate with whatever political party you want, at least in some parts of the world. But talking to the United States, you can freely associate with whatever political party you want, and everything about your identity has collapsed down to the level of the self.
Okay. So, right. And so then you see these tensions all the way down. Now, one of the biggest tensions around right now is it collapses down to the self. Well, that's right. But then it also goes right back up to the nation. So dread Christian nationalism. Dum, dum, dum. Evident in almost every mainline university campus for over 100 years. And I've read before the opening of this book by George Marsden, where he describes Duke University, where they have this Gothic cathedral built at the beginning of the 20th century as you have compulsory chapel. This is Christian nationalism because they're connecting heaven and earth, and they're doing it in a mainline Protestant waspy way. Now the Protestants have this stuff sort of built in because it's built in sort of in a special way. You have Robert Bellah coming along in the 60s and talking about American civil religion, where you've got Abraham Lincoln, who, what day was Abraham Lincoln shot on? Would it have been Good Friday? Is Abraham Lincoln the Jesus figure of American civil religion? And of course, in the Christian Reformed Church, feeling ourselves a little bit outside the American thing, because are we really Dutch? Are we American? It takes multiple generations, but many of the Dutchmen are really uncomfortable being American, so which is the reason for being of the Christian Reformed Church in 1980. Andy Kuyvenhoven says we have to burn the wooden shoes and zip all the way to pandemic times, and dum dum dum. Americans have their religion mixed up with their politics. Dum dum dum. But don't we always? Because we always have these tensions. And we're always working them through, and they go back and forth. Well, this is all about the patriarchy. Except, dum dum dum, Amy Semple McPherson. Feel myself channeling our Damian Walter in the way that he talks to his video. Amy Semper McPherson and the resurrection of Christian America. But how old was Donald Trump when Amy Semper McPherson had her heyday? Dum dum dum. Wasn't even born yet. In the brisk fall evening 1934, 6,000 people jammed into the Exotic Shrine Auditorium, the largest and poshest theater in Los Angeles. The crowds on this particular night had come to witness the only showing of a spectacular religious pageant like nothing they had seen before. At close to 9 p.m., the orchestra came to life, launching into a rendition of patriotic songs. The curtain swung open and the show began. America's Pilgrim Fathers stepped onto the stage to rousing applause. They reenacting the landing of the Mayflower at Plymouth Rock and proclaimed the new nation's foundation on conservative Christian ideals. The Founding Fathers appeared next. They drew up the U.S. Constitution, a document conceived in prayer and executed by Christian gentlemen. The third scene featured Abraham Lincoln on his knees in prayer, seeking guidance to his God in the times of national stress. Without a doubt, the Protestant God that had blessed the United States. Now, this book is sort of written in the style of maybe another book written by someone who teaches at my alma mater, she who will not be named. This harmonious vision of the United States Christian past began to disintegrate in the next few scenes. However, a subsequent generation of Americans who spent too much time trying to be modern forgot that God founded this nation. Notice how all these tensions are just sort of, they're so minute and high resolution that we just don't see them very clearly anymore. They removed the Bible from schools, embraced the concept of biological evolution, and determined to blot out the God who led and nurtured the United States, turned away from the old-time religion. Again, this is 1934. Some of you say, I remember this from 1984. Countdown to Armageddon. Dum, dum, dum. At this point, in the spectacle, the orchestra fell silent and a hush stole over the capacity crowd. The audience tensed. as a sinister villain, an atheist and a communist, appeared on the stage. He began his diabolical work by tiptoeing up to an oversized dollar bill and, using a hammer and chisel, chipped away the words, "In God We Trust." Then he sneaks over to a massive poster featuring the lines of the national anthem. He reached down, grabbed a brush, and began splattering red paint across all references to God. The stunned audience gasped in horror as the scoundrel obliterated the ideas that had been the very blood and body of our nation, a very foundation upon which it was stood through the years. But he wasn't done yet. The curtain opened again for the climactic final scene, revealing the villain's ultimate target, the United States Capitol. Now, just a pause. For those people who do a lot of hand-wringing about Christian nationalism today in the church, I dare bet nobody for the last 50 years has seen anything like this in 1934. Above the Capitol building flew an American flag, while below it stood the sturdy foundation of stones of government, order, faith, and home. Miss America was supposed to be protecting these cherished institutions, but she had fallen asleep on the Capitol steps. They had Miss America in the pageant? Boy. How about Miss Universe? Who owns that pageant? Anyway, back to the story. The fiendish burglar laughed disdainfully as he snatched the foundations of the nation right out from under her. Then he replaced the flag with the red banner of communism. Just when it appeared that the rogue had completely undermined the United States, onto the stage stepped a stunning woman dressed entirely in white, Amy Semple McPherson. The crowd went wild, cheering and screaming for the radiant cultural icon who had created this show. McPherson smiled and bowed. Then, in her high-pitched nasal sing-song voice, strained by decades of preaching without amplification, shouted, "America, awake! The enemy is at your gates. They have penetrated your walls, America. You are in danger, and enemy power is penetrating your strongholds." So, absolutely. There is death in their hands, the bombs of atheism and of communism and of anarchy. America, awake! Defend your own. Responding to her cry, Uncle Sam jumped onto the stage. He sprinted forward, captured, grabbed the villain, issuing him a ticket back home, a ticket back to Red Russia, a ticket that will take him to the land where the stars and stripes did not wave. Now, of course, America would be sending weapons to Red Russia a few years after that, but we'll hold off on that for now. At the end of the scene, Miss McPherson approached the Capitol. With the entire audience cheering her on, she removed the subversive's flag and returned Old Glory to its position atop the dome. The crowd again erupted into applause. Thanks to McPherson and Uncle Sam, the Christian foundations of the nation were safe once more. Although McPherson did not ever identify the villain, her audience knew very well. The pageant was performed on 2 November, just a few days before Californians would be going to the polls to elect the next governor of the Golden State. McPherson, along with most religious leaders in the region, favored the incumbent Republican Frank Merriam. And the governor faced an unexpected challenge in the person of Upton Sinclair. Can you imagine? Upton Sinclair, the octopus, those books that we read in high school about, modernity and the corruption of industry and the poor workers. The famed novelist, radical, and now Democratic candidate for governor, because Sinclair leaned far to the left politically and had in the past been critical of institutional religion. Many religious leaders, along with businessmen, journalists, and even Hollywood executives, viewed him as a tremendous threat. As a result, Merriam's supporters did everything they could to undermine Sinclair's campaign. Their crowning efforts had been an invitation to McPherson to stage this spectacle at the Shrine Auditorium. They knew that no other religious leader in the nation could weave traditional patriotism, the old-time religion, and Hollywood pizzazz into such a spell-binding political pageant. Dazzling religious theatrics and a penchant for publicity made McPherson one of the most famous American personalities of the interwar years. The first religious celebrity of the mass media era, she mastered print, radio, and film for use in her evangelical mission. Her integration of the latest media tools with the conservative creed established precedents for the 20th century's most popular ministers, from Billy Graham to Oral Roberts to Pat Robertson. Possibly more significant, she brought conservative Protestantism back from the margins to the mainstream of American culture by arguing that Christians had an obligation to fight for the issues they believed in and boldly proclaiming the patriotism and the faith that were inseparable. And I thought it was the moral majority that brought the fundamentalists back. These things are quite perennial. Now, they have their waves and they have their ups and downs and they have their nuances, yes, but the relationship between faith and government, between the universe and the local, these things have to tie together some way, and they will. And I'm not trying to bless one side or another. I'm just trying to show that every time we sort of bring it to the front and say Christian nationalism, it's like Book of Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. Contemporary evangelical politicians, from local school board presidents to President George W. Bush, were indebted to McPherson for convincing the faithful that their citizenship in heaven did not nullify their citizenship on earth, but rather that they should work for a more Christian nation. Finally, in her extraordinary religious fervor and theatricality, McPherson helped shape one of the 20th century's most explosive religious movements, evangelicalism. And she did it, of all places, from just outside Hollywood, California, my state. McPherson's religious revival caught the nation off guard with rapid urbanization, the discovery of new technologies, the perfecting of powerful forms of mass communication, the rise of the modern university system, and the growth of, now if you look at, well, yeah, the universities, they're about to change, and they're already well underway. By the 1930s, universities are, well, you don't have to take those Christian courses anymore. You can take English and history and the liberal arts program, because the liberal arts program is basically the religion for the people who aren't religious. And, well, you know, some Protestants with less education will feel the tension, let's say, between Athens and Jerusalem, but, you know, your classicists will just sort of like church fathers say, and C.S. Lewis say, oh, no, there's actually continuity between that discarded image and this new modern vision. There's so much particularity in all of this. Yet from her location in the burgeoning show business capital of the world, McPherson changed the way American religion is practiced. She combined the old-time faith, showbiz sensibilities, marketing savvy, and the passionate Americanism to revive a seemingly dead movement. Rather than wither away evangelicalism in its careful integration of cutting-edge technology, American patriotism and social conservatism has become one of the most influential forces in America. Now, of course, I can bring in Molly Worthen's wonderful book on the Apostles of Reason, which makes similar arguments in the post-war years about, of course, Billy Graham and Carl Henry, and although they'll stay sort of a step away from politics, except Billy Graham, of course, will be the presidential counselor all the way up to George H.W. Bush, and on we go. Why all of this? For me, the interest is in getting a higher resolution and a better grasp on the relationship between basically how we put our world together, how we integrate all of these things. And in many ways, Why the interest in the Grail, in universal history? Because it's that cross, remember? And you've got the vertical axis and you've got the horizontal axis, and they meet, and they always have to meet somewhere. Now, I'm not saying one place is as good as any other place. I'm not saying that at all. That just reality doesn't simply work out that way. I am saying we never get it right. We never get it perfectly right. They're closer and further, but into this people throwing rocks at Christian nationalism, it's like, you have your politics too. You might have your Christian globalism, or maybe you're an anarchist and you want to sort of step away, and maybe you're looking at this and say Christianity shouldn't institutionalize. The difficulty is that things form. It's like I used to 20 years ago talking to these hardcore libertarians that say taxation is theft. Oh, okay. How are we going to pave the streets? Neighbors should come together and pave them together. Oh, okay. I certainly know that probably on the street, one person's going to sit back and fold his arms and say, all these people really want a paved street. I bet you if I pay nothing, that they'll pave it anyway, and then I'll get to keep my money. Oh, the free rider problem, and then the commons, and. There's nothing new under the sun. There's the universal. There's the particular. They're going to have to connect some way. And people are going to find ways to have them connect. And they're going to use narrative to have them to connect, because narrative is both a sense-making, a very powerful sense-making skill, and it's a compression engine. In other words, it isn't just sort of made up out of whole cloth. It actually compresses realities that are too large for us to really understand and to see and to actually be real clear about it. It compresses them down into something, just sort of like, it wasn't Megamind, it was Galaxy Brain. That was it. That was Galaxy Brain. And you're going to have to run those compressions. And we're going to outsource our sense making to one another. And you get to have a narrative. You get to have a theology, no matter how good or bad. You get to have politics, no matter how good or bad. And hopefully, if we actually continue to not kill each other, but to talk together and work together and do so productively, maybe we all might learn something. Maybe we all might accomplish something. Maybe we all might, live in harmony. What a lovely note to end this video on. So now that I've touched on just about everything to annoy almost everyone, leave a comment.